three questions which are embedded in that painting. Where do we come from? Who are we? And where are we going? And so you can see that all these questions are very intimately related to the field of consciousness. And when we look at consciousness studies, I have just picked just three statements, and you will see how vast, how encompassing they are. So for example, Francis Crick from biology, he says it's the major unsolved problem. Danielle Dennett, who's a philosopher, he says, well, and I'll come back to Danielle Dennett a little later, he says when we understand consciousness, it will be different. And Susan Blackmore, in her very famous book, in the preface, she says, well, if you study it really, this field of consciousness, it'll change your life.
Yeah.
So, because the study of consciousness has so many arms and so many tentacles, it's not surprising that there is an amazing convergence, and it's a truly interdisciplinary field of study. So you see here, and there are some that are unrepresented. You see here all the physical sciences and computer sciences, life sciences, cosmology, etc., etc. Now, let us continue the philosophical framework that we had in the morning session. If you look at the Oxford University Press 2018 document, they say that as of now, there are 5 great unsolved philosophical questions. Okay, so this is their version. And as you can see, do we really have free will? Well, it's very closely tied to consciousness. I'm sure all of you will agree with that. Can we know anything at all? The epistemology that we talked about in the morning. Then, of course, the very central question: who am I? What is death? So, the point that I'm trying to make is that when we look at philosophy, consciousness is kind of, except to kind of just differ a little bit from what Professor Kapoor said in the morning, and that is that time and space, they are products of this Big Bang singularity. And then the question really, which is extremely interesting for physicists, for cosmologists, is that how will this universe end? And there are again different models. I will not get into them, except to say that, well, one model basically says that, as you know, this Hubble came up with this law that these galaxies are receding from us at faster and faster rates, and that this will continue. So if that continues, then we will get the big rip. The other model says, well, it is increasing. The gravity is not strong enough to hold these bodies, but soon it will become, and when that will become, the process will start to reverse. That means it will start to contract. And if it starts to contract, then we will have the big crunch. But my question is a little different today, and that is, no matter how this universe ends, what happens to the intelligence or the information that is present in this universe? And this question, we will come back to it, because when we come to Vedanta, we will see that the Vedantic understanding, the Vedantic framework is very consistent not only with this universe, but even the concept of multiverses, which many physicists have proposed, that it's not just one, it's multiple and repeated universes. Then we come to something which, of course, this conference is on practical, the applications of Vedanta in practice. When we come to consciousness studies, perhaps the most practical question that we are grappling with is, can AI become conscious? And again, when we look at AI, there are these two kinds of AI, if you want to simplify it. There is the strong AI and the weak AI. And proponents of the strong AI, they vigorously believe that once we reach a certain level of sophistication, maybe we are not there yet, but very soon we shall reach them. And once we reach them, then we can conceive of an entity which will have cognitive states. So, and this percentage of, let's say, computer scientists who believe this is rising very rapidly. And then there's, of course, this other part of it, weak AI, which assumes that machines do not have consciousness. That's what we typically understand today to be. They just simulate thought and understanding. But then we come to a more, I can say, fundamental question, and that is, what is this role of phenomenal experience? Because we always know consciousness from a first person's perspective. Whereas by definition, artificial consciousness is accessible only through a third person perspective. So, we'll come back to this a little later. Now, when we try to understand consciousness, we have to be very careful because there are many layers to it. So I have just taken from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy the 3 levels or 3 concepts. And the first one is the entity itself is conscious, a conscious entity. It is sentient, it is wakeful, it has self-consciousness. That is very, very critical. And it has what we call as qualia, these states of subjective qualitative experiences. So then we come to being conscious of something. And the last one being a state that is conscious. So when we are indulged in certain activity, then we are in a conscious mental state. Now, as you can imagine, it is interdisciplinary. It has, if you look at publications in consciousness studies, the rate of growth in publications is truly astounding. But there are some very fundamental problems. And perhaps the biggest one would be that as of now, there is no definition that is acceptable to all who are experts in this field. Then, I talked about Danielle Dennett. There are people like Dan Dennett and some computer scientists like Marvin Minsky and so forth, who say that, well, there is no problem at all. We have artificially made up this problem. As long as we study the brain and as long as we can use our understanding of the brain to write computer algorithm, we will be fine. There is no problem really in consciousness studies. There is no such thing as consciousness, so the problem is self-created. Okay? So that's one view. Then a number of people, they believe that it is an epiphenomenon. That means consciousness is caused by the changes affected by the brain. So the brain, when you map the brain, and we'll come to that a little later, when you map the brain, you see these neurons firing, and based on certain patterns in these neuronal firings, the brain believes that there is this composite of all this is what we call the big I. And so the brain tricks you. So my response to that is, if the brain tricks us into believing, then this must be the longest and the biggest trick ever humanity has seen. Because it has been with us, at least in human consciousness, from the time humans arrived. Then some people say, well, it's a mathematical problem. It's nothing really embedded problem as such. It's just a question of magnitude because we are dealing with a huge amount of interactions. And then the most cited number is 100 trillion. So if you have 100 trillion neurons, they interact and they come up with all kinds of patterns. And it's just that we don't have, as of today, the computer algorithms to process or to even predict them. And then the final one is, well, and that is where quantum mechanics comes in, that it's a wave function which collapses, and that collapse of that wave function is what we believe or what we think to be is consciousness, okay? So all I'm trying to say is that there are these questions which we cannot get away from, okay? Now, when we look at consciousness studies, perhaps the biggest contribution is from David Chalmers, because he very neatly and very elegantly said, well, consciousness studies we can neatly subdivide into two: easy problem and the hard problem. And the easy problem doesn't mean that we have solved it. It's just that there is a certain methodology, there's a certain history that when it kind of goes through its natural progression, we will be able to. So that's where neuroscience comes in. So you take some process and you correlate it with the neuronal mechanisms. And once you have perfected it, or once you have understood it reasonably well, then that problem is solved. But the hard problem, as David Chalmers has put it, is the puzzle of conscious experience. That is, how these physical interactions and these physical arrangements, how do they give this first-person conscious experience? So, if I am feeling pain, doctors can tell now, based on brain mapping, that it is because of these neurons firing in the certain parts, and it's this response and stimulus with whatever part of the body is feeling the pain. But the pain itself that I'm feeling, how do we get to that? That is perhaps hard, because you cannot just say that, well, if we understand the neuronal mapping very well, we will be able to tell, because that is very, very subjective. So, and now we come to the opposite of it. And this has also started to become very prominent. And perhaps the greatest exponent of this is Galen Strawson. And Galen Strawson believes that we have kind of reversed this, because we have said consciousness is the biggest unsolved, it is mysterious. He says there's nothing really mysterious in it. Because what is consciousness? Consciousness is basically having that conscious experience. Once I have a conscious experience, that is all that we need to know. There's nothing else that really is important. And as you can see from this quote by Bertrand Russell, he says, well, if we look at matter, if we look at the physical stuff, well, that physical stuff, our understanding is through this lens of consciousness. So he says, we know nothing about the intrinsic quality of physical events, except when these are mental events that we directly experience. So now we come to these very, you can say, distinct schools of thought in consciousness studies. And so, again, to go back to Galen Strawson, he says, well, when you talk to physicists, the reductionists in a way, they say, well, physics is just a bunch of rules and equations. Very elegant, of course. They explain a lot of things. But, as Galen Strawson asks, well, what breathes fire into these equations? What makes these equations a universe for us to describe? And of course, we come up with all kinds, physicists that is, come up with all kinds of explanations. They say this dark matter, dark energy, etc., etc. But basically the answer is we don't know. And this we don't know is couched in these terms, okay? But one thing that is for sure is that physics reveals itself as this stuff takes the form of conscious experience. So it is again through this lens of conscious experience that we interact with matter. Right. So, well, of course, the way to understand consciousness, at least in the present framework, is through the brain. So, we talked about neural correlates. Neural correlates, what they do is, well, they put you under some kind of, typically fMRI. They look at the firing patterns in the brain, and then they say, well, what experience are you having now? So once the subject tells what is the experience, that she or he is having, and then when they map it to the firing in the brain, then they can now correlate. That means if this is happening, that means the subject is having this particular set of thoughts. And we have made tremendous advances in this field. I mean, if you look at publications in, for example, one just area, computer vision, we now, once we look at these brain patterns, we can get a lot of information and a lot of understanding of these processes. What many scientists have done is, of course, they have taken fMRI of many subjects in different states of consciousness. So, for example, if you are in vegetative state, what is your brain pattern? If you are if you are sleeping, non-REM sleep, REM sleep, if you are active, if you are agile, what brain patterns do you see? And now we have come to very good understanding of this neurology. And we have moved even one step farther in the sense that now we can predict the experiences that the subjects are having. So you can see it can have tremendous practical applications. The one which has caught the attention of many experts is in court cases. Well, today, if you are a witness in some court case, you take an oath and then you say your version. And the question is, how do we know whether you are saying the truth or not? Now, if we come to this state of neuroscience, then we don't really have to put you under oath or anything. We just look at your brain patterns, and from there we can predict what you are thinking. So, tremendous practical applications. And there have been a lot of studies on this relationship or neurobiology with awareness. So you can look at wave patterns, brain wave patterns, and there are certain ranges. For example, Crick and Koch, they believe that it's in 35 to 75 hertz range, and that is correlated with awareness in a number of different modalities. Okay, so then we have now a lot of data with Professor Davidson's research, where he puts Tibetan monks who have had long, more than 10,000 hours of meditative experience, and so he puts a normal subject, a control, and these Tibetan monks, as you can see, and then they ask, well, right now think of, let's say, sympathy, think of love, and then they look at how these brain waves, they change. And it's a very methodical and very rigorous study. But I just wanted to kind of distill what Professor Davidson, that is, believes that when you look at these high amplitude gamma oscillations, these are indicative of neuroplasticity. So the idea being that the brain is plastic. It does have the capacity to change based on the training that you give. And that's where these Tibetan monks come, because they have had this remarkable, tremendous experience of meditation. So now they are able to control what to bring in their frame of reference, what to avoid. And that again, of course, is very, very practical, because the central question that you may be wondering is, well, why do I care about consciousness studies? What will I get? And the answer is, from the yogic perspective, what you get is, if you follow, let's say, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras or whatever, if you follow this particular pattern, this particular method, then it will give you the control over what emotions, ideas, thoughts you want to associate with or do not want to associate with. Because most of our problems are that let's say I am depressed, I am depressed because person A was very rude to me. And the question is, how do I get out of this depression? The more I try to forget about this person A, the more I remember the person A's rudeness. So in this particular case, the meditation part and the neuroplasticity part comes in very important. And then I'll just point you to another study that Andrew Newberg at University of Pennsylvania did. And again, this was with Tibetan monks, but a little different kind of study. I'll just point you to what Professor Newberg's conclusions are, and that is that during meditation, people have a loss of the sense of self and frequently experience a sense of no space and time. And that was exactly what they found in the brain mapping. And then Newberg concludes that when someone has a mystical experience, so of course, when you look at Tibetan monks, then their experiences, you will be most interested in their mystical experiences. So when someone has a mystical experience, they perceive that sense of reality to be far greater and far clearer than our everyday sense of reality. And this is nothing new per se, because when we read the biographies of masters like Sri Ramakrishna or Ramana Maharshi, then this comes up again and again, that what in the mystical state, when they try to relate, they say that what they saw was far clearer than what our senses typically perceive the level. Professor Kapil Kapoor talked about our senses being imperfect. And there are verses in our Upanishads. Kathopanishad says very, very clearly, these senses are imperfect, they are weak. So when you have an experience that is not through the senses, then that experience gives you much greater clarity. So, since the sense of spiritual reality is more powerful and clear, perhaps that sense of reality is more accurate than our scientific. By scientific here we mean what we gather through the senses, because science is basically, it's either our senses or extension of our senses through these different scientific advancements. All right, so now let's come to Vedanta. What does Vedanta have to say? And Vedanta, I just wanted to make one thing clear. When Vedanta talks of consciousness, we typically, when we translate it into English, we say it is pure consciousness. Because, again, our experience with the English language as understood is when we typically talk of consciousness in our daily talk, for example, it is always consciousness of something. Whereas when we are looking at Vedantic texts, if we have to understand them, then it is not consciousness of something, but consciousness itself. So that's why this adjective pure is the recommended way to go about it. But I think Schrödinger, he perhaps came up with the best possible, and the most elegant way to put it, and that is that it can never be in the plural, only in the singular, and the plural of which is unknown, and that there is only one thing, and that which seems to be a plurality is merely a series of different aspects of one thing. Remember in the morning, Professor Kapil Kapoor talked about this, that mithya, the translation, of course, we run into all kinds of problems when we try to translate mithya. But if we look at it in the perspective of Maya, then as Schrödinger says, it makes perfect sense. Okay, so then the other thing that we want to make it very clear is that when we talk of Western science, and of course people keep objecting every time I bring this up, they say there is no such thing as Western science or Eastern science, science is science, and I kind of agree. But all I'm trying to say is that in this Western science model, it is brain that is the supreme. And that is why you have so many people who believe that, well, if I understand the brain, that means that's end of this knowledge. There's nothing further beyond it. And in the Vedantic tradition, that's definitely not the case. Because brain is also a product in a way. And as we have seen, if we can control whatever that entity is, let's not get into the semantics, but if brain can be controlled, then definitely there is something beyond the brain, because that's what is controlling it. So, coming back to Schrödinger, every man's world picture is and always remains a construct of his mind and cannot be proved to have any other experience. So this first person experience, this plays a very important role again and again. And I am reminded of this story. There was a king, and the king one day came to court and he said that I am feeling miserable because I have a snake in my stomach. And then his courtiers, his ministers, they said, no, king, there is no such thing. You cannot have a snake. It's just your illusion. And then he said, I'll chop off your heads, because how come you question this? I know I have a snake in my stomach. Who are you? So, but the question is, how do we solve this problem? So an intelligent minister came and he said, I can solve this problem. And then he did something to the king. The king came back. The king was very happy. He lavished all kinds of gifts on this minister. And so then, of course, people got curious. They asked this minister, what did you do? What magic did you do? He said, no, I didn't do anything. I just gave the king a lot of laxatives. And I told his servant to keep a dead snake in the toilet bowl. But the point being that if you have this first person question, you cannot solve it by this third person, all kinds of answers, right? But then we come to perhaps the central point in Vedanta, and which is best, I think, expressed in the Kena Upanishad, the very first verse. And that kind of hits the nail on the head, because as you can see, when it says Keneshitam patati prayashitam mana, and same about prana, and same about vacham, and same about chakshu. So, by whose will? What is impelling our senses? So that question, of course, best captures our Vedantic understanding. I mean, at least puts the question towards consciousness. All right, very, very good so far, so forth. But when we look at the second verse, the very next verse, when I first came across it, I thought, well, this is a cop-out. I mean, this is a non-answer answer. It says it's the ear of the ear, the mind of the mind, the speech of speech. Oh, what kind of answer is this? But then, if you kind of study deeply, you will see that what this verse is implying is that, well, it's our problem basically comes from the identification of the self with the senses, okay? So once we start dissociating ourselves from that, and in meditation, that's what typically we try to do, in one kind of meditation. So a thought comes up, you say, well, this thought, it's not me. And soon another thought would come, and again. So you try to dissociate from those thoughts. This is not me, this is not me, this is not me. And by the logic of residue, what will remain would then be consciousness. Okay, so of course, then the next two verses, they basically say that, natatra chakshur gacchati and so forth. I'm not going into the Sanskrit verses because we are running short of time. But in the fourth verse, what is very interesting is they say that we have heard this from the ancient teachers who told us about it. So, when you try to disseminate this kind of knowledge, the experience of the teacher plays perhaps the most critical role. Because when you, for example, get initiation, the teacher gives you some mantra. That mantra is, of course, it's just a sound symbol. But that symbol is a representation of something much more profound and much deeper. So I'll just skip this. So then the question is, well, I said earlier, well, there is no defined definition. There's no definition of consciousness. In terms of Vedanta, it's very clear. It is that whatever that you are aware of, that is not consciousness. So that we have to be very clear. Okay? And what the entity that is aware, that is consciousness. But of course, you can never really catch it. And we again have many verses. I just put on the screen the first verse of Drik Drishya Viveka, but we will not. Again, the last word, Drigeva Natu Drashyate, again, it's saying, well, this witness cannot be perceived by any of your senses, or the mind, or even the intellect. Okay, I'll skip this. Except to say that, well, when experts in consciousness typically talk of this subject, they say, well, if you are into a coma or if you are in deep sleep, then there is no consciousness. But there is absence of any experience. But Vedanta is very clear, and Vedanta just says it's just the opposite. It's not that there is an absence of experience, but it is the experience, but experience of absence. So your framework is continuous, okay? And I'll end with what I think is the best definition of consciousness in Vedanta, which comes from the Mandukya Upanishad, the 7th verse. And of course, it's pretty longish. But when you read it, you see how rigorous it is in terms of its approach, where it says what it's not. Na anta pragyam, na vaishpragyam, na ubhayata pragyam, na pragyana ghanam, on and on and on. Adrishtam, avyavaharyam. So the point being that the central problem with consciousness is we always try to grab it, we always try to understand it. And this verse and many other verses, what they are saying is you cannot grab it, because that is its definition, that allows you to grab certain things, but that itself is not grabbable. Okay? So, with that, because we are running out of time, I thank you for your patience, and we may have time for a couple of questions. Thank you.
We have time for 2 questions, and I already see the hands of Alex.
You said that it's not grabbable, but the Shishya asks the Guru, what is it? And the Guru tells the Shishya, Tat Tvamasi, Aham Tat, Tat Tvamasi. Now it's not that the Tat is grabbable, but somehow the comprehension is grabbable. That's why we're all here. We find that comprehension or incomprehension fascinating.
Yes.
I'm sorry, it's not a question.
I agree. It's not grabbable, but if you get to that state, the question dissolves, basically.
Right.
First of all, thanks a lot for a very illuminating presentation, Professor. I have certain doubts. You started with the notion of qualia and came to Russell, then Galen Strawson, David Chalmers, Davidson, even to Nielsberg. I'm a little bit concerned because according to me, it's a serious question whether we should go to neuroscience and social linguistics to solve the problems of philosophy, and that also the problem of consciousness. I think to take data from other disciplines has to take certain kind of propositions, like let's say realism, the mind-body relationship, which are not distinctly the problems for Vedanta as such. And the perspectival relativity in philosophy is not the empirical relativity, let's say, of Einstein. So we are functioning in a different kind of compartment. So I was just wondering, why are you starting with the Western psychological notion of consciousness so that you can come to Vedant's consciousness? Because these are the class apart and the comparison can be made only between the comparables. Thank you, sir.
No. Let me rephrase. My idea here was not really to compare as such. It is to say that consciousness studies, because of their importance and their criticality, we have to look at this where all kinds of contributions are coming from. So I talked about neurosciences, I talked about Western philosophy, and I tried to say, well, our Vedantic tradition also has a lot to give. It's not to say one is better than the other or nothing like that. It's just a different way of understanding, trying to grapple with it. But it is very different in terms of its framework. That's all I'm trying to say.
Thank you, Professor Sengupta. We have to move on because we are running a little bit late, but I'm sure he's here for 3 days. If we 4 days, we can definitely grab him. We may not be able to grab other things, but we can grab him. So our next speaker is Professor Amara Papu, who is, he's already introduced to you. He's going to speak on foundations of society, Dharma, Li, and natural law. Can you take about 20 minutes, Professor Amara?